Just figure it out here. I'll get that. Get my pointer ready. Well, you know the drill by now. Gotta get the coffee in me. Mm. Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to History by Phillips. I'm Mr. Phillips, and this is part 3 of the lecture series over medieval Europe. In today's lesson, we'll be talking about the kingdoms and crusades. In this lesson, we're going to start talking about the emergence of England and France, the Slavic states you might recognize as Russia, and we'll be talking about the Crusades. Uh, Another thing very important that relates to United States history, we'll be talking about the Magna Carta and why it came about. I digress, but the whole thing to keep in mind in this lesson is the Christianization of Europe. In this lesson, basically all of Europe's going to become Christian in the form of Catholicism. Keep that in mind. That's going to lead right into the Crusades. Just to refresh your memory, a Crusade's a holy war. In this case, it's going to be Christians versus Muslims over the quote unquote Holy Land. Both religions claim it's their holy land, but they're going to be fighting over Constantinople and right here in Jerusalem in Antioch. Uh, I digress. Let's get into it. So first, we're going to talk about the Kingdom of England. England. So this guy right here, Alfred the Great. He would unite England. He's tired of these Viking raids. Remember, most of Europe's pretty good for farming, raising crops, except for this little region right here known as the Scandinavian Peninsula. And here's where you find the Vikings. The Vikings, since they can't really grow their own food and stuff, they resort to distilling it in form of raiding. So they get in their longboats. We talked about the longboats in the first lecture video of this series. Those longboats allowed these Vikings to pretty much travel and hit the coast of Europe, especially around here in England, parts of France, and even down here to Spain. But these Vikings will be raiding. Alfred the Great, he had a great idea about, hey, we're tired of getting raided. Let's get an army ready. So Alfred the Great would start developing an army. It pretty much put an end to the Viking raids. The Viking heyday would pretty much die off by the late 800s. They would still continue raiding up to about year 1000 to 1100, but it wouldn't be as prominent. Instead of getting ready like maybe once or twice a week, it dropped down to like maybe once or twice a year, if that. But that's because Alfred the Great, he decided to unite England, start getting an army ready for these Viking raiders. But after King Alfred died, England had a series of weak kings. They just not strong leadership, and hopefully you recognize if you don't have good leadership, your society, your kingdom, your empire, what have you, it's not going to function well. So England starts going back into this feudal area where nobles are fighting over who should be in control. Well, in 1066, the last English king died. Well, not the last, but this English king would die without an heir to the throne. He did not have a son or daughter. So what you'll start seeing is nobles next in line in feudal society. Because remember, at the very top you have the kings and queens, and right beneath them you have the nobles. Well, there's going to be two nobles going to claim England, the throne of England. You're going to have somebody named Harold Godwinson. He would claim the throne. He's uh, from England. He's kind of a Viking mix. Then you also have William, Duke of Normandy. Basically, a duke's like a really fancy knight, the Knight of Knights. Blah blah blah. But Normandy will be right here in northern France. For my World War II bus, if you know what D-Day is, where they stormed the beach, that is Normandy. That is northern France. But he's a Catholic, so you have two nobles claiming they own, uh, claiming the throne of England. William, Duke of Normandy's claim is like he's the 17th cousin of the fourth sister removed from the family. Long story short, he says he's related to the English king, so it should go down to him. Harold Godwinson was just like, no, I rule the place. I'm going to take it. So, do you think they was able to talk it out and solve their problems? Of course not. This is feudal society. They're going to fight it over. Uh, so in 1066, you're going to have something called the Battle of Hastings. That's something to make note of. The Battle of Hastings. Uh, Obviously, the Pope's going to support the Catholic, William, Duke of Normandy. He would defeat Harold Godwinson. There's several reasons why he was able to defeat Godwinson. Godwinson didn't have a army as good as William, Duke of Normandy. William, Duke of Normandy, he was able to train his troops, provide for his troops, give them weapons, give them arms, all that sort. While Harold Godwinson was kind of not a cheapskate, but he didn't put as much emphasis on it, and he basically caught Harold Godwinson slipping. Caught him on a muddy slope, big cavalry charge, wiped out most of his army. The fighting would ensue, but eventually Harold Godwinson and his army would be defeated. Here's the famous scene where Harold Godwinson is shot and killed. Uh, but what you have is after the Battle of Hastings, you would have William, Duke of Normandy, pretty much be named the King of England by the Pope. It'll be made official on Christmas in 1066. Basically, you have a Catholic running England now, so you're starting to see all these countries, the way we recognize them today, they're becoming Christian in the form of Catholicism. But from then on out, he'll be known as William the Conqueror because he conquered England. But this is going to kind of make some of the English folks, the Anglo Saxons, mad a little bit. Uh, for instance, I know we just had a presidential election. I know it's been very controversial, but imagine all of a sudden, instead of having the Republican or Democrat nominees win the presidential election, we had somebody, let's say, from Brazil become president, an outsider become president, don't speak the English language, all that stuff. A lot of Americans be like, hey, who's this guy? Like, why is he ruling us? He doesn't know our culture. He doesn't speak our language. Like, who is this guy? So you start seeing some infighting. So William the Conqueror had to deal with that for a little bit just because he was an outsider. And plus, the feudal system's still in place, so he's giving land to the nobles. These French nobles are starting to own land in England and such. With this, it's going to start causing some tensions between the English and French. Uh, just in case you don't know, the English and French like to fight when they're bored. Uh, that's what I tell my class anyway. It helps with when going to U.S. history in eighth grade. Keep that in mind. The English and French they start not liking each other because of this, or not just because of this, but this is a good part of it. But I digress. But yes, now you have William, Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror. He is now King of England. But after William the Conqueror came, sorry about that typo right there. Should have threw an E in there. After William the Conqueror came, King Henry. Uh, he would come. He would take the throne. His reign would last between the 1150s to almost 1190. But his claim is he would establish the rule of law. One thing is habeas corpus. It's a Latin term. I forget what the Latin meaning means, but basically, a criminal is brought before a judge, and that judge determines that person's guilt or innocent. Back in the day, let's say the local authorities caught you, and they just throw you in the dungeon for a while, and maybe forget about you. Not fair. So you realize this is not good. So he started implementing this habeas corpus, where the presumed guilty would come in front of a judge, and the judge would determine their guilt or innocence. Also, what you start seeing is a grand jury. This jury is basically saying, bringing up the case to determine if it actually needs to go to court or not. The defense will be like, hey, this person couldn't do it because he wasn't here on that night, while the prosecution will be like, yeah, here's his murder weapon, he owns it. From there, the judge will decide if this court or if this case should be heard in a court of law. And if it does, it's going to go into a trial jury. I'm sure many of y'all recognize this before, but maybe seen in TV scenes or things of that sort. But basically, what a trial jury is people of the local community are summoned to court. They will hear the defense give their arguments why this person should be innocent, and you'll hear the prosecution to telling the jury why this person is guilty. After everybody's made their arguments, the jurors they would go into a room and they would deliberate. They would talk amongst themselves and try to figure out who's this if this person is guilty or innocent. We still implement this today in our society in the United States. It's called a trial jury, but this will be started up under King Henry II. Moving on from him, King Henry's son would become king after his death. King John, almost right around the year 1200. Uh, just to oversimplify this, King John was terrible. Uh, most folks don't like raising taxes. I don't really know anybody that does like having higher taxes, but taxes do have their place. They help provide for public goods like for roads, hospitals, schools, things of that sort. Well, King John, he was just raising taxes way too much. Some of his policies led to him having to raise taxes. Those were bad policies. But what you'll start seeing is these nobles and some of these knights, they're not liking this whatsoever. So they basically cornered King John and they forced him to sign a document, pretty much forced him to sign the Magna Carta, also known as the Great Charter, in 1215. This is very significant, especially to us as the United States, as American citizens. What the Magna Carta does is it pretty much puts the nobles as a collective. That's the thing, puts the nobles as a collective on the same level as the king now. So if the king starts doing something a lot of the nobles don't approve of, the nobles can come in and check or stop him somewhat. This would be what you call it, developed over the years and more streamlined. But you can see this today in our society in the United States. Instead of having a king and the nobles, well, today you got Parliament in Britain, but I digress. But instead of seeing kings and nobles, in the United States we have the president and we have Congress. Basically, the same thing here. They're able to check each other, stop each other from acting inappropriately. Also, the Magna Carta protected certain rights, rights that you might recognize today, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, things of that sort. Uh, the Americans would adopt this eventually, because if you don't remember, the 13 colonies, we were originally English citizens, but because of the king at the time, in the 1770s, he was violating these rights. So the colonists were tired of it. They broke away and decided to start their own country, known as the United States of America. Go America. I'm sure you've heard of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. A lot of that is pretty much not word for word, but it's very similar to what the Magna Carta was. They just essentially rewrote the Magna Carta because England was violating the rights of the colonists, so the colonists were tired of it. So they'd implement their own with the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights, so on and so forth. But I digress. Yeah, after King John, you had King Edward. He would eventually set up Parliament, the Parliament in England. All it is, that's just the English version of the U.S. Congress. That's all it is. Next, we have France. Not really much to say about France. Charlemagne divided up. Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great, also known as the father of Europe. I've been trying to drive that home with my students lately. Charles the Great, father of Europe. He divided Europe into three parts. The western part would be known as France. At the times, the nobles were richer than the kings. Didn't make sense, but unlike King John, King Philip was he was more tactical about how to raise taxes and how to raise money. So he did it in a smart way. All of a sudden, you start seeing France becoming rich, and a very powerful nation at the time. Keep in mind, they are also Catholic. So right now, basically, all this is Christian. The Christianization of Europe is taken away here in medieval Europe. Next, let's talk about the Slavic states. You might recognize it as Russia. The Slavs would take over Kiev. They're known as Kievan Rus. Now, nobody really knows the background of Kievan Rus. It's suspected they have Viking ancestry because the Kievs come from like this region right here. So they think it's a little bit of Viking, maybe a little bit of some Asians and Mongols come from this way. But well, not Mongols, but some Asians anyway. Nobody really knows their ancestry. They're there right now. But in that in 988, the Kievan Rus leader Vladimir he would end up marrying the Byzantine emperor's daughter. If you don't know where the Byzantine Empire was, if you don't recall, it would be the eastern part of the Roman Empire, to be the last part of the Roman Empire before it finally collapsed. Yeah, but they was more Greek than they were Roman, to be honest. They spoke a different language. They didn't speak Latin like the Romans; they spoke Greek. But that's not here or there. Hopefully, you learned that with the Byzantine chapter or Byzantine lessons from last semester. I digress. But basically, you have Vladimir. He would marry the Byzantine emperor's daughter, Christian. So all of a sudden, about overnight, not overnight, but in a short time, all this would become Christianized, except for this little region, because you have the Vikings holding out in Scandinavia that still believing in the pagan religions, as you call it, like believing in Odin, Allfather, Frades, all that stuff. But for the most part, Europe has Christianized now at this point. Uh, but then don't forget about the Mongols. The Mongols are kind of like the wrench in the history. They just wreck everybody's world, to be honest. But they were great in some things and terrible in others. But the Mongols would come over. They would drive the Slavs out of Kiev, and they would migrate north to Moscow. That is significant because today the capital of Russia is Moscow. Uh, capital is Moscow. Ivan III would eventually drive the Mongols out, and once they got the Mongols, they started paying them tribute from Moscow. Tribute is basically bully money, paying the bully off. Until Ivan III, he was able to gather enough strength and a big enough army to force the Mongols out of the Russian territory or the Slavic territory. But the big thing to keep in mind from this is uh, Europe's Christianized now. Mostly Catholicism. You still have some Eastern Orthodox here. Hopefully, you remember the difference between the Eastern Orthodox Christians and the Catholics. Just a real quick. The Roman Catholics believe the Pope should be in charge of everybody, all that good stuff. They don't believe using icons or images of Jesus because they believe that's to be idol worship, and that breaks one of the Ten Commandments of Christians. Meanwhile, the Eastern Orthodox, they believe the king should be ahead of everybody or the patriarch. Uh, they allowed the use of icons so they can teach. Because remember, not everybody, most folks can't read at the time, so they think, well, using images of Jesus to help drive home a lesson is a good thing. It's not idol worship, so that is a big difference. But essentially, they do the same thing: same sacraments, same traditions, same customs. Just those few little nuance differences. But keep in mind, everybody's Christian now. That's the big point. Everybody's Christian now. So you start having the Crusades. So the Muslim Turks, they would take over Constantinople. If you didn't know what Constantinople is, it is the capital city of the Byzantine Empire located here. It's in modern day Turkey. It's not called Constantinople anymore. It's called Istanbul. Istanbul, it'll be renamed that after the Muslim Turks took it over. But the Muslim Turks would take it over. The Byzantine emperor at the time, he would ask the Pope back toward Italy, Pope Urban II, for help. He's like, hey, the Muslims are taking over the Holy Land. We need your help. Can you help us out any way that you can? Now, the Pope, he's wanting to help out his fellow Christians, but it's kind of a two-sided thing here. Because remember, these guys are Eastern Orthodox. So if he's thinking to himself, if we help these guys out, more than likely they might come back to Roman Catholicism. And if everybody's a Catholic in this region, I'm the head Catholic because I'm the Pope. I would pretty much be in charge of Europe. I mean, yes, the kings will still have a part to play, but for the most part, the Pope will be recognized as the most powerful person. So the Pope decided to help him out. He would call on the kings and nobles of Europe, from like England, France, Spain. It's not Germany at the time, but pretty much Germany, all these areas. He's like, hey, let's help these folks out. He started a crusade or a holy war to take back the Holy Land. This will be a war between the Christians and Muslims. Now, a reason why, let's see what I have on the next slide. Yeah, but the reason why a lot of folks would join the Crusades is because they want to be forgiven for their sins. Because back in the day, uh, they believe you, not believe, but you had to buy something called indulgences. Basically, all an indulgence is a pretty much a receipt saying you're forgiven for your sins. So let's say I'm a sinner and I want to be forgiven. I would go to the church and I would buy an indulgence and I would be forgiven. The problem with that is, especially with the peasants, is they couldn't afford these indulgences. They're almost living a hopeless life. It's like, I want to be forgiven, but I can't be forgiven because I can't afford these indulgences. Well, the Pope, to help get the armies bolstered up to fighting size, he pretty much issued a proclamation saying, hey, your sins will be forgiven if you participate in these crusades. Well, folks not wanting to go to hell, they're like, well, I'll join the army. Now I don't have to pay for an indulgence. I get forgiven of my sins and I can go to heaven now. So what you start seeing is a lot of folks are joining the Crusades. I wouldn't say necessarily because they care so much about Jerusalem and Constantinople and all that stuff, but they just didn't want to go to hell. They want to go to heaven. This is how they were forgiven, so they would jump into these crusades. So let's talk about the crusades. So the crusades would start. The Christians would win the first crusade in 1099. They would take over Constantinople, but they didn't really think this through. Uh, they didn't really think this through because once they took it over, they realized, oh crap, we're still in the middle of Muslim country. What are we doing? So eventually, after Muslims realized, oh, they're attacking us, they got together and they was able to drive them back out of Constantinople. That would launch the second crusade after the Christians were driven out of Constantinople. But the Muslims are ready for it this time. They know that the armies are coming. They beat them back instantly uh, with ease. The third crusade will kick off when this man right here, a very smart man, a tactical leader, probably a man before his time. His name is General Saladin. Saladin, he would capture Jerusalem. This would spark the third crusade. Christians would try to come back, take over Jerusalem. He'd be able to knock them back. But with this exposure, with this one, Saladin, he would send his own doctors to help out the Europeans when they get hurt. They was also teach them because at the time Muslims almost made education mandatory for everybody. You didn't have to be rich, all that stuff. So the Muslims they had a lot of advantages in these crusades. One, they're fighting a defensive war. A lot of these armies they've had to come march across Europe. They had to travel a long ways just to get there to fight. Meanwhile, the Muslims, uh, they're there, they're ready. They just have to wait on these folks to show up. Another reason is they're climatized. They're used to this. These Europeans, they're still using armor, heavy plated armor, chainmail. Ideally, you think armor would be a great thing to have in war, but in this climate, it's just going to overheat you. You're going to pass out, have heat injuries. So they wasn't dealing with it. Also, the Muslims were more educated at the time. They had a bigger emphasis on education. They had better technology. Uh, basically, Muslims were better in every category when it comes to war at this point. They had better governments at the time, just more efficient. Uh, but yeah, the man to make note of is Saladin. The Christians would lose a majority of these wars because remember, this is still considered the Dark Ages at the time. The Enlightenment hasn't happened yet. The Renaissance will be coming about here soon. A lot of these, you can think they're still living in the dark while the Muslims they're progressing, so on and so forth. But let's talk about the other side of the Crusades because with wars, it's not always about fighting and killing. What you also has is Crusades. It brings people together. What you start seeing is Europeans coming into contact with Africans, Africans come to contact with Asians, Asians with Europeans, so on and so forth. You start having Christians intermingling with Muslims, Muslims with Christians, even atheists. Yes, there were still some atheist folks, but you start seeing different folks coming together. They're trading goods, they're trading ideas, trading cultures. Uh, Example I like to use is: do you think folks in Mexico eat the same food that we do? Obviously not. So they're getting exposed to all this different stuff. Uh, Things in particular that the Europeans got from the Muslims, in particular the Seljuk Turks, would be how to build domes. I know that might not sound significant, but domes are one of the most structurally sound buildings you could have. Like if humanity ever gets erased off the planet, domes would probably be the last artifacts that we ever existed because they're just so well built. They'd also build mosaics. They learned how to stain glass. That is a big thing back in the day. Just having colored glass. They learned that how to build better boats. But the big ones was having maps. Muslims where they've been educated. Uh, Hopefully, we get to talk about the Baghdad House of Wisdom. It's located here. It's in modern day Iraq, the Baghdad House of Wisdom. But they've had scholars here. They've been studying up on a bunch of stuff. But they've been trading with China. They knew about Europe and Africa. Meanwhile, Europeans they sort of know about Asia, but since they come in contact with these folks, they're learning about all these different trade routes, about all these different goods, especially like silk and spices coming from China, sugar, even lemons. I like to say they've had lemonade. Europeans finally got lemonade now. I'm just teasing about that. But I digress. But hopefully you catch what I'm throwing here. A lot of these folks they are uh, intermingling with each other now, trading ideas. You'll start seeing cultures evolving and shifting. But one thing the Crusades did do was bring an end to feudalism because everybody was wanting to be forgiven for their sins, a lot of folks took off here. Now they'd either die or they just move, change their homes, what have you. Uh, but because of this, it basically just left the kings and some nobles left back at home. So basically, all the power would get consolidated at the top with these kings. You don't really see too many lords and ladies and nobles anymore. It's basically just kings and queens now because everybody decided to go participate in the Crusades. But also with the Crusades, you start seeing persecution of the Jews and Muslims. Don't blame them for like taking the lands of Jesus, disrespecting Jesus, things of that sort. Uh, this will be very bad for the Muslims in Spain during the Reconquista. We'll be talking about that in the next lesson, I do believe, in Spain. Yes, Charles Martel did drive out Muslims from Spain, but he didn't drive out all of them. The ones that remained are about to get persecuted pretty bad. Also, the Jews are going to be persecuted really bad in Europe, especially when the Black Death comes. That'll be 2 videos from now. We'll be talking about the Black Death, but we know today that the Black Death was caused by a virus carried over by rats, so on and so forth. But back then, they believed it was the Jews' fault because, quote unquote, the Jews killed Jesus. So they're going to blame them. It's going to spark off a lot of religious rivalry between all these groups. But that's all I got for y'all today. I do believe, make sure. Yes, that's all I have for you today. This has been History by Phillips. I'm Mr. Phillips. Y'all take care, stay safe, and I'll see you guys next week. Maybe figure out how to do this. Yeah. Take care, stay safe, see you guys next week.